let's start off with the first page of the contract. Look at paragraph 2A. The old contract really just had an indication there whether or not the transaction was going to be cash or whether or not they were going to obtain a loan, and then it had some contingencies on obtaining a loan. This paragraph 2A, 2A1 that deals with cash specifically talks about if you're making an offer to purchase the property for cash and financing is not a contingency, then these are the things that apply. What is new there is the appraised value of the properties you see at the end of the first sentence of paragraph 2A1. Now, typically, and this is typically, and a home buyer who's paying cash for it does not go out and get an appraisal. I mean, that's just typical. But sometimes they do. And I've seen it happen at the beach when they're buying beach property, that sort of thing. That can be stricken out. We put these in there in order for them to always have an opportunity to say, okay, do we want, because if a seller is getting a contract and it has two contracts, and one says, I want it to be appraised, I'm buying it for cash, both cash transactions. One says, I want it to be appraised, and the other says, I don't, then that seller needs to have an opportunity to say, which one is a better deal for me? So that's why we put that in there. We're not again, we're going through a process, a learning process here, what is logistically feasible for a realtor, for the title companies, for the lenders. If something is not going to work, then we're going to change it. The way the contract, we went through the contract process is trying to take from the eyes of the buyer and the eyes of the seller, and when a seller gets two competing offers. One of the things that was done in here, for example, let's just take paragraph 2A1, the cash transaction. And I want to show y'all something there. The second line, it says, not contingent on obtaining financing or appraised value of the property. Mm-hmm. Okay. And later in the contract, you can see this. You can scratch, if you're representing the buyer, scratch through the appraised value if you want to make sure this property appraises. A lot of times buyers don't care. They're going to pay cash. They don't care about the appraised value. Remember, they're going to have an appraisal done to determine the appraised value. That's going to be at their cost. Scratch through it and say, contingent upon appraisal. Okay? That's all you've got to do. Don't get wrapped up on the actual forms. Like I said, it's a template. It may be appropriate, though, that you review that with your broker so that it's clear to everybody what you're saying. But if you want to make it contingent upon an appraisal, then put it in there, contingent upon appraisal. Just keep in mind, obviously, that your buyer needs to be aware that there's going to be a cost for an appraisal, since it's a cash transaction. So that's an example of what I'm saying. Don't be intimidated by the written document as much, but look at who you're representing. As I've explained to so many people, if you're a buyer's agent, you're in the most risky position you could possibly be in as a real estate agent. More risky than listing agent, more risky than limited consensual dual agent, because your utmost loyalty, faithfulness, experience is dedicated to one side of that transaction, who happens to be the buyer, who wants to buy typically as much house or maybe more than they can afford. And then they don't have the money left over to do the things to correct any of the problems, so then they start the complaining process. So I'm not trying to be negative against buyers, I'm just looking at it from the standpoint of what I've seen. So if you're a buyer's agent, when you're looking at this contract, look at it from the standpoint of what I want my buyer to do and not do. If they want to get out on sole discretion, because this contract doesn't have that, then put it in there. Put it in there. It says buyer reserves that this contract is contingent upon buyer's satisfactory inspection or whatever. You can write it in there, because the way it's written now is that if the seller gets a document that doesn't have that language in there and gets a competing offer that does have that in there, then that highlights for the seller to say, which one do I want? The one with the contingency language is a higher price, but this one doesn't have a contingency. So it highlights them for them. Where the problem came up with this discussion about that paragraph, and you'll see it in here, but remember when you had the seller's buying the house, contingent upon inspection. If I find anything wrong, at my sole discretion, I can walk. Y'all remember that, right? There were more complaints coming in from agents saying that buyers were entering into contracts with an intention to continue to look, and if they found something better, using that to get out of it. And they wanted some way to avoid that, to say, if you're going to make an offer for a purchase, then let's make sure it's a good faith offer, and that you give the seller an opportunity to cure the defect that's causing you to back out of the contract. That's why the right to cure is in there. If your buyer wants to have the contingent fund inspection to their sole satisfaction, write it in there. Just remember that that seller is now on notice. And this, see, I'm trying to make it, in my mind, a transaction friendly as opposed to buyer-seller situation. The seller will now know that that buyer can walk from the contract. You know, at their sole discretion within that 7, 10 day, whatever period of time that there's inspection. So the old one was kind of hidden in there, and a lot of times you would have sellers say, wait a minute, I'll fix that. There's nothing wrong with that kitchen wall. It's perfectly fine. I'll fix it. I'll do whatever they want to. No, it's their sole discretion. They want to walk. The seller's mad at the agent because the agent didn't explain it to them. The seller doesn't want to release the earnest money. You get into all that kind of dispute, how the earnest money is released. So we're looking at trying to make a way to make it transaction friendly, as opposed to buyer friendly or seller friendly. Now, keep in mind, if you find this is what I would advise every buyer's agent. If you find any quote defect, and whatever that is subjective, put it down on your request. Keep yourself in the superior negotiating role, because you make that request to them and they don't do it, then your buyer can say, I'm out of here, you're not fixing it.